So, I know we raised hands, but the story behind the Phantom could be shrouded in mystery. It could be that it was not even really witnessed, but just heard and smelled. There's a story of a dark room with a card game. And also, just for me, it began partly when I left New York. For me, it's kind of like watching a Godzilla movie. It was an eye-opening event that sort of gave me an idea of what lurked beyond the lift line at Alpental. And And one of those things about the Phantom that was really interesting was that while it was an avalanche, it also is a place that has spawned many dawn patrols, powder runs. How many people here have skied the slot? Just a few? Yeah, I mean, we've all skinned up that thing, sweating, just praying that the backside is as good as the front side, or we get around before it melts and becomes heavy, wet snow. But the thing is, it's like it takes an act of destruction to create something that good. And when we look at it, you can see that it's a pretty big open swath of terrain. And the age of those trees, somewhere between the 200 to 400 year range, but it wasn't that long before where it was actually plotted that there would be a maintenance shop down there, and even longer before that, we've been mentioning Monty Atwater and Ed LaChapelle. It was assessed in the 60s that wasn't even a slide path. And when we look at it, and then there's this 19-year-old kid from New York who didn't dress right when he came out to the Northwest and wasn't really prepared for the kind of weather that they have out here. And also just I was a ski racer. I carved ice, not snow as we have it here. And one of the things that happened was when I got to my sophomore year in college, I was like, I'm gonna ski all week. And I was really psyched about that. I had set my class schedule up so I could actually get out every day. And there was this window where it kind of was a weird season. It started kind of slow, but suddenly it just started dumping every day. And in that 19-year-old mind, this was me. I was coming up every day, free refills, and that was cool. I thought this was normal. And and I was super excited. And then one day, I actually realized I didn't know anything because the pass is closed. I'm like, what's taking so long? What's going on up there? I had no idea what guys like John and Mark Moore and Rob Gibson and Craig Wilbur were doing. I just knew that they were disrupting my POW. And that was really important because, sometimes you have one event that actually just changes your view of the world, and this was probably one of them. Because when I got up there, this was trees, and this is what happened. And, when you hear the description, all you hear is just they heard this giant roar and then this smell of pine. And when you look at that, that's like 50 acres and hundreds of millions of pounds of quality lumber that just got blown down. And when you consider the size of that thing, and that people like Ed LaChapelle were like, that's not an avalanche path, you're like, well, how do we know anything? And this is what I saw when I got up there. That's all those trees down, vehicles just shoved aside. And it's amazing that no one actually got hurt. The road was closed for several days. But that wasn't the only ski tour that was born that day. How many people here ski the Kendall Trees in High Hazard? That's it, really? A lot more voices on turns all year, you'd swear. Oh yeah, it's safe right here. Yeah, but that used to be safe right there too. That's that was an intact old-growth forest of hemlock. And and when you hear debates like, I always go here in high hazard. Well, that was high hazard safety until it wasn't. And so that was one of many runs born that day. DOT had their own routes. We all know granite. But what was interesting was when this route over here, before 1990, this was all intact. And then there's Granite Zero, because Granite Zero was more or less born that day, because suddenly it went all the way to the road. And you can see the timber right there. And Rampart was another area. Cle Elum Lake had several D4s that opened up new terrain. There's the start zone. But right here, that was just an old growth forest, just hanging out, not doing a thing. But what was interesting was last spring we went to go find some information on the weather that created this, and it wasn't there. There was a lot of data, but there wasn't the story, the background to this amazing event that gave us a lot of ski terrain that we take for granted today. And one of the things about the weather that was really interesting was it was kind of a non-event for a while. Like you look at December, and if you notice, there's no blue. It's kind of, yeah, because the DOT had some really deep thoughts on what was going on. You could see winter's gone. There's no snow. They were contemplating where to buy their plane tickets to a place that had snow. And so then January rolls around, and you could see, there's a little tease here, but there's this long spell. And it was enough to drive people to think that we may never see winter. We talk about a few weeks of doldrums getting all itchy. This is like 2 months of no real winter. But then the end of the month happened, and in just a span of this was the beginning of that 17-day, 17-foot cycle. And it was pretty much an unbroken storm. And I can vouch, I skied a lot. I don't know if my professors noticed my absence, but I wasn't there. But here you were, just like overnight, suddenly winter's here. But it wasn't exactly stable. And we're saying goodbye to Garth, but this was the Cascades welcoming Kenny Kramer. It's like, this is the DOT, like, good training for the new guy. Because embedded in all this weather were layers and avalanches that ran to the road. And it was pretty remarkable because throughout that cycle, you look at it and it just came all on at once. Embedded in there were weak layers, active slide paths that went to the road. And so, at the same time, with all this activity, there was a lot of stress. There was basically every day there was more avalanches coming down. There was some fatalities. But at the same time, they didn't have time to look up and maybe contemplate what could be coming. And so, but in the meantime, they were seeing pretty sizable avalanches. 8-foot naturals are not normal. And, but again, so that's that. And you look at the hazard, it was pretty much pinned at high and considerable. And the DOT were seeing avalanche paths run the road. But then, as they rolled from January into February, it was even getting busier. I talked to John Stimbaris about, he was working as a lift op, and basically they shoveled, skied, went to bed, and repeated. And then at the time too, there was this idea that they just weren't keeping up, that the storm was winning. And so there's been, we kind of know that rain on snow is bad, and obviously atmospheric rivers are a lot of rain on snow, which is really bad. And one of the challenges that occurred was that while this storm was happening, and eventually it did sort of pivot to where they weren't keeping up, You can see right here, it's like, oh wow, that's a lot of rain. That's what those lines mean when they're really tight together. And what happened though was 6 inches overnight, but in a 48-hour period, it was kind of slow to warm up, and as this was happening, then you went from what was old tree skiing to this. And it was pretty remarkable, because one of the things that the Craig Wilbur kind of was really emphatic about was that the warm-up wasn't immediate, and it kept snowing up high. And when they looked up at that, they didn't see the start zone. They saw a lot of trees. And so for them, they weren't expecting this. And even the day it happened, the Alpental Patrol was just trying to clear out around the road, and they weren't even worried about shooting over there. They were worried about the chute next to it. This is known as Shop Chute. And that was what they were concerned with. And when you look at it, it has all the aspects of a big avalanche path, but it had an old-growth forest that was 400 years old sitting in it. So, what would they expect? And so when we looked at it, Mark Moore and Kenny put out a forecast, basically concerned that they were going to take out mature timber, but they weren't really no one really anticipated this. They're thinking existing avalanche paths, not new ones. And when you look at that, that's 50 acres of trees that were gone, which is a big part of that. And if you put a number to it, it's somewhere in the 200 million pounds of timber that got blown down and across the road. It didn't hit the maintenance shed. There were 2 guys in it that, wow, luckily they weren't outside. They would have been in the creek. Because here's piles of debris, and several vehicles were buried and impacted. And that's a buddy's van. One of John's friends had to leave their van when they left there. And the thing is, they closed the road. The highway had already been closed for 4 days at that point, and they just hadn't been able to keep up. And there were supposed to be ski school buses that day. And so, and the thing is, where that debris was, where they were contemplating putting a maintenance shop. And at that point, they changed the location of the maintenance shop. And at the same time, when we looked at that, we were just looking at the forces that were involved. But at the same time, all the guys working up there, in 1990, yeah, they knew rain on snow, and they had a gun, they had a recoilless that they would fire at that thing. But kind of like Godzilla in the beginning, one of the things they learned is that, shooting shells at Godzilla didn't really help. You kind of shrugged it off and kept moving. And that's, these big slopes and these big paths don't really notice small charges. They notice, 17 feet followed by 6 inches of rain. And for us, we ski tour in these places all the time now. It's one of the take-homes. It's like, look at turns all year and arguing where you should go and, where you should avoid because there's so many people. A lot of these places are high on that list. But the interesting thing is this idea that we know where it's going to be safe, all the time. And that idea of safety is a bit of a myth, kind of like Godzilla, in the sense that when we look back at this cycle, I don't think we need to worry that we don't know that rain on snow is going to create big avalanches. What you look at with these events is something else, is the idea that, if you're using trees to date your avalanches, and your oldest trees are 400 years, and we know there are cycles that have a return rate of 500 and 1,000 years, how do we really know where those are? If you guys have guys like Ed LaChapelle looking at a slope and not seeing an avalanche path, why should we be any different? It's one of the sharpest minds of the avalanche industry, looking at terrain, but that cycle is so big that it's actually hard to comprehend. So when you're skiing in old growth trees and looking at, like especially around Kendall where you think it's a safe zone, those slopes above are all 30 plus degrees. And so And one of the things about that avalanche warning that was given then that's true today is that in those moments when you forecast extreme avalanche cycles, the idea that that old growth 400-year-old forest is safe probably isn't true. It's just a myth that you're holding on to. The other thing, the idea with these cycles is that the trim line changes all the time. In the 50s, Craig Wilbur said there used to be quite a few of these rain-on snow events, and even around Red Mountain, where we have a lot of history, the trim line has moved up. It was different in the 50s and into the early 70s. It was lower in the valley. And so for us, when we look at this, at what we consider safe, when we're challenging the forecast, especially when we get into these big storm cycles, and this cycle wasn't specific to an El Nino, La Nina event. It just happened to be a big storm. And so when we look at that idea, it's just really important for us to step back and understand too that when you do have large wet snow that entrains a lot of trees, it might just take out more trees and go a lot further than you think. But the other thing that it's good to leave us with is the idea that when we go out, it's good to hold on to your uncertainty. What don't you know? The idea that we need to know what we're doing isn't really important. It's probably easier to kind of wrestle with the gaps and work those out, because those are the ones that kind of can keep us out of places that we may invent the story. Because for me, this story was 20 feet in 18 days. It just got bigger and bigger the longer I was away. And honestly, when I was 17 feet in 7 days, it still sounded big, but it got smaller. And then the Phantom, who was the Phantom? Was it a dark night? Was it a large beast? And then, as a lot of things, it was a card game, a rough card game of guts and possibly some beverages and the night before. And it was a hand in a card game that was what ended up, it was the mysterious hand that was dealt. And then that led to the next day when they're out traveling through deep snow, and then sudden mysterious event happened. And so it was named after a card game, not a big beast from a Japanese island in the middle of the Pacific. And the last thing, just to put it in perspective, this idea of mentorship, this was an event that changed the course of what you guys ski. I don't know how many of you ski toured before 1990. If you do, raise your hand. It would be nice to know. Yeah, because you should turn to these guys and ask where they skied before the Phantom, because we take for granted that these places are ski tours, our go-to, and when in fact it's just an event slightly out of our consciousness that occurs. And for us, it's good to just keep in mind that when we do have large events that are beyond our scope, just sit back, take into view, and see what happens, and not be at the bottom of one of those avalanche paths. And one of the things I would like to do is acknowledge the people who helped me with this project. And that is, this was started as part of a AAA workshop. And so Don Sheriff really was instrumental in gathering the information. John Stimbaris and Craig Wilbur, Mark Moore, and as well as Garth Ferber, all contributed greatly to giving the information and the photos to kind of bring this event back so we could see it and understand it, and then appreciate what it gave us. Out of destruction came creation, and so I'll leave it at that, and thanks for your attention.
We have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions for Matt? Got a question up here, Forrest. Or maybe we can make it to the mic. Perfect. You can come on up to the mic there on the stand. That's great. Hold on for just a sec. We got the mic.
I didn't hear you mention it and wondered if anyone considered that long dry spell leading to the Phantom and whether or not those 400-year-old trees had given up their grip on the ground underneath them on account of the drought.
So the idea that the dry spell created weakness within the trees, is that the question? So the way that when I spoke with Craig about this, his belief was once it was a dry release that dug into the saturated snow, and once it snapped a few trees, those trees then became part of the destructive force that then took out the trees below. He didn't really worry about. I'm not sure there was a drought associated with the dry spell itself. That's not something that was brought up. But the idea that once a few trees were in that dense debris, that they then helped break and smash a lot of the older trees that were down below.
Awesome. Next question.
You mentioned snow, and I'm wondering if it would be the amount of new snow is where we get these events that change the forest. I'm wondering if it would be useful to consider it in total amount of precip. You mentioned that there'd been 2 feet of water content in there, and so that's question 1. And question 2 is, do you have any comments on what it takes to get started? And this is kind of following up what you were saying. Of once you've broken a few trees, they can propagate, but what's it take to get started for these really big events?
So the water content, you know, one of the interesting parts about the journal that the DOT had was the basically once the storms began. I mean, it's kind of the beginning of a Public Enemy song. You know, once it began, it was all over, because essentially there was facets and crusts that developed throughout this storm, and actually large naturals, as well as a lot of triggered slides that went to the road on DOT paths. And so the interesting thing, and I even asked Craig this, it's like, you know, the idea that there was the 2 feet of water and 17 feet of snow that actually was sitting up there. You know, it was the idea is that maybe it might have been a slab of like 4 to 5 feet that initially began breaking trees up high. But the thing is, those trees were just big enough, and the debris, as it gouged into the more saturated snow, was dense enough that as it broke a few trees, then it just continued to gain in its destructive potential, and it's what continued to take out the forest below. And that's how Craig described it. One of the things he also brought up the idea was that it is possible that as the trees snapped, they might have actually, you know, in their orientation might have been such that they were sideways and were able to snap the trees as they went down. You know, but I mean, it's an event that happened 27 years ago, and no one actually physically saw it. In fact, they weren't even able, in the days after, they never got a clear view of the top. They just were able to see the trees and the debris pile below.
Cool, awesome. Thank you very much, Matt.